ideologies of sustainability. I'm just going to give you all some quotes from some left and, well, not just left, various critics of the sustainability discourse, just to share with you some of the problems that have been raised around this concept. So this is from a political theorist named Tim Luke. He says, in the final analysis, ecological sustainability boils down to a new form of economic rationality to remake world politics. In a search for the lowest cost method of reducing the greatest amount of pollution in the industrial turnover of global production processes, sustainable development became almost magically an economic and not merely environmental calculation. So what Luke is saying there, just for this first cut, is that it's never just ecological or environmental. It's always tied in with institutions and power relations, including related to the economy. This quote, by the way, is from a chapter by Luke, which is called Sustainable Development, Neither Sustainable Nor Developmental. So it's a full attack on the whole conversation. Second cut, let me skip that one. Second cut is basically the discourse about resilience. I'm not going to skip it after all, let me show you. So there's a whole conversation about how cities and societies need to be more resilient. And some years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation set up a C40 resilient cities and then a C100 resilient cities, in which they funded a chief resilience officer in cities all around the world to try to address some of the climate crises. That program was recently defunded, but in that context, for roughly about a decade, this concept of resilience was in wide circulation as a kind of normative goal for cities to pursue, and not only cities. And this is from my friend Tom Slater, a critique of this resilience discourse, and a kind of poster. I believe this is from this was put up in, I believe, New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, which says, stop calling me resilient. Every time you say they're resilient, that means you're going to do something else to me. I'm not resilient. So it's kind of basically voicing in a certain way the subaltern, a kind of imagined subaltern perspective on resilience discourse, which, so the argument goes, is actually a legitimating foil for new projects to kind of impose new forms of exploitation and expropriation upon previously dispossessed populations. So a certain skepticism about resilience as kind of a managerial strategy of domination rather than as something that's really empowering. So another dominant discourse, which again, we're going to encounter in both Davis and Droga, is the idea of lifeboat cities. The idea, this is the C40 again, that cities are the best positioned social units to address the challenges of climate change. A counterpoint to that argument, that's a bigger debate. This recent article by Hilary Angelo and David Wachsmuth, two of our authors from one of the shorter pieces we read for today, recently published this reflection. Why does everyone think cities can save the planet? And the counterpoint to that, which several critical scholars have been developing for some years now, is the idea that, well, it's not so much these projects to promote cities as ecological leading edges of modernization. It's actually more of a project of eco-apartheid. So this is what Mike Hodson and Simon Marvin wrote almost a decade ago. Ecourbanism may represent an attempt to build privatized and bounded ecological spaces that can anticipate and transcend ecological constraint and climate change for their users. So in a certain way, this came up a little bit when we were talking about Jakarta and other projects a couple weeks ago, but these ecological urbanism projects, they're kind of like gated communities in a certain way. They create a kind of enclavized zone of ecological sustainability or protection, which excludes the bulk of the population. So a case in point would be, if you've read about Hudson Yards, this kind of mega development project on the west side of Manhattan. So the buildings in Hudson Yards are advertised widely as being ecologically sustainable, resilient, and so forth. But it's literally like a bunker. It's this massive bunker where apartments cost millions and millions of dollars. The grounds are surveilled by private security and police forces. And its resilience is sort of, it's like a lifeboat for the uber wealthy of New York City and the globe. which doesn't really address the broader generalized vulnerabilities of the population of the region. So this idea of ecological sustainability or ecological urbanism, is it public? Is it democratic? Or is it open? And what would that look like? Or is it privatized and bounded and exclusionary? So in a certain way, the kinds of logics of sociospatial division that we've been discussing all quarter now wrapped up in a kind of beautiful ecological packaging. So it's sort of presenting Engels's, class polarization, or Du Bois's kind of racialized city as kind of ecologically advanced. So highly problematic. And again, there are examples of this nature from all over the world that one could elaborate. I'm just going to read the bottom part of this quote from Maria Kaike and Eric Swingedow, two colleagues who've written a lot of critical work. They've done a lot of critical work on these issues. They're basically talking about how there's all this attention to new eco-technologies that seem to embody a new consensus in urban policy and urban planning. But meanwhile, the global ecological conditions continue to deteriorate at an alarming rate. And then this in yellow, the highlighted passage, the first-class urban passengers are busily building rescue vessels, while ecological refugees drown in the Mediterranean, and others continue to live in the proliferating socio-ecological wastelands of their degrading environments. This is the problem. This crystallizes the problem, I think, very dramatically and in a very disturbing way. And so much of our discourse about ecological modernization, ecological sustainability, it's susceptible, unfortunately, to this critique, because it delinks those concerns from broader questions about social, spatial, racial injustice and counteracting strategies of social, spatial, racial justice. So social, racial, and environmental justice are intermeshed. And to the degree that they're not, there's a danger that ecological projects of urban restructuring will actually exacerbate forms of social and racial injustice. So there's also a kind of techno-modernist discourse. I put up this example from some years ago of Masdar, which was a city in Abu Dhabi that was built as kind of designed by some pretty famous global architects, Sir Norman Foster and his office, as kind of a completely ecologically sustainable city. There's a lot of such discourses and projects being mobilized not only in the Middle East, but also in China these days. A very interesting book by Julie Zee of UC Davis, looking at some of these projects in the context of climate change in China. I highly recommend the book. And this is, again, Kaike and Swingedow call it a certain kind of non-performativity. So it claims to be performing, but it's actually a legitimating frame for non-action. They say it's a depoliticizing techno-managerial pursuit that characterizes dominant modes of environmental governing, and that it sutures the ideological landscape and forecloses more politically grounded modes of producing a more egalitarian socio-ecological mode of governing and transforming the urban ecological commons. So the kind of notion that like technology can save us, be it through geoengineering or carbon sequestration or designing these kind of elaborate technical machines that putatively don't emit any, they have zero emissions, which I won't go into it, but that claim itself is empirically contentious, just because building a place like Masdar, you're moving all kinds of stuff around, you're extracting all kinds of materials from the earth. Once you build it, maybe it can be claimed to be zero emission, but the process of assembling the built environment, it has to also be analyzed. And if you don't, it's completely absurd to claim that it's a zero impact site. Yeah, I'm going to skip this one. It's basically more of the same. And I'll give you one other one. This is from Mohsen Mustafavi, my former dean at Harvard Graduate School of Design, who wrote a lot and edited a big book on ecological urbanism. He poses the question pretty concisely. He says, he's just posing the question, like, what are we talking about here? And he says, Mustafavi says, how can the city with all its mechanisms of consumption, its devouring of energy, its insatiable demand for food, ever be ecological? Sorry for that typo. it is relatively easy to imagine a city that is more careful in its use of resources than is currently the norm, more energy efficient in its daily operations like a hybrid car, but is that enough? Mustafavi asks. And I couldn't resist but run with the hybrid car metaphor, just as a way to really drive home the critique. I think it's pretty clear from all these other pretty sharp critiques, but I took the opportunity to look up, a pretty expensive Lexus, hybrid Lexus. It's a $50,000 car, y'all. So it's sort of like, the ecological, a lot of what's presented in cities around the world is kind of ecologically, advanced urban planning and urban ways of living. It's effectively like a luxury vehicle. And the big question that Daniel Aldana Cohen, that Hilary Angelo, David Wachsmuth, and Daniel Aldana Cohen, and many of our other authors, Mike Davis as well, are posing is, can we have a kind of ecological approach to city building and urbanization processes that isn't simply a gated community, an expensive hybrid luxury vehicle, but one that actually enhances the life conditions, both for humans and non-humans, for everybody. That's democratic, that's inclusive, and that affirms diversity. I don't have the answer to that question, my friends. I really don't. But I'm just saying, like, in a certain way, I could stop the lecture right now. I'm going to keep going, but I'm just saying, like, the whole point of running through all those critiques is that that question in mainstream urban social science and mainstream urban planning and mainstream urban design is not frequently enough posed. And again, I've been in this world for a while, and I can't tell you how often I go to conferences, events, studio reviews, where people are like, it's almost like they're just bowing down like to a totem in awe and admiration of fancy new technologies that are claimed to solve the problem, and which are completely delinked from the kinds of social and political and geographical modes of analysis that we in a class like this have been trying to develop. So before we even start the conversation about using these concepts, I think it's important to just hammer these critiques pretty hard. So I'm not saying don't use these concepts, but in a certain way, what I've been doing for the last like 10 or 15 minutes is putting up a big warning sign, caution, ideology is at work here. So you've got to be maximally alert to the ways in which many of the discourses that may look authoritative because it's in a fancy book or it's published by a apparently authoritative institution, a government, the World Bank, the UN, or who knows what, you got to be skeptical and ask these hard questions, whatever work you're doing in this field, which I think many of you are interested in it from conversations I've had with students in the class. Ask these questions and find data. It's not that hard to find, actually, that enables you to pose these questions in relation to the kinds of dominant ideologies. On some level, one could argue, well, isn't it a good thing that people are now talking about sustainability and ecological urbanism, whereas maybe 20 years ago or longer, they weren't? Well, I would say a couple things on that. It's a long conversation, but number one, there actually have been other discourses about the environmental dimensions of urbanization and urban planning going back 150 years. And there's quite an interesting history. You read Mumford pretty closely for this class, and he's a pretty relevant figure. Number two, the problem is that so much of the current discourse about environment is paying lip service to the putative problem, which then basically generates a false and dangerous sense of complacency that we're actually doing our best to address these issues, which actually precludes and blocks more substantive public discourse and collective action in relation to these problems. I'll give you one concrete example of this before I go on to the rest of the lecture. So I had a doctoral student many years ago at NYU who wrote a brilliant dissertation about municipal recycling in New York City. Samantha McBride, she published it under an MIT Press, Recycling Reconsidered. And basically what she argued was that the constant public reminder to recycle your trash was reactionary. And she comes out of like the left environmental movement. And why did she argue that? She argued that for the following reason. She had worked for the, and still does actually work for the Department of Sanitation in New York City. So she knows what she's talking about. It turns out, at least when she wrote that book about 10, 15 years ago, something like 90% of municipal solid waste in New York City is industrial. And the whole recycling discourse in New York City, at least at that time, was focused on household waste. And what Samantha McBride argued was that the reminder to recycle served as essentially a capitalist strategy to deflect attention from the 90% of industrial solid waste around which there was no conversation about recycling. So that everybody thought, save the planet by throwing your plastic, bottle, Gatorade bottle or whatever into the recycling. And okay, you're done. You've done your part. Ciao. And McBride was kind of saying, well, this is really absurd because what we actually need is to have a political conversation about the industrial externalization of all of its environmental impacts. But because people are so focused on households, they completely black box that realm. So that's just an example of a much broader problem, which I think Luke, Swing It Out, Kaika, and the other authors I've just quoted are dealing with. So I'll give you one other one just from just one other layer of critique, which is part of this kind of cautionary argument. So basically, this is from the Wachsmuth, Cohen, and Angelo piece, where they're basically saying we've got to be very skeptical about the mainstream approaches to carbon accounting, which similarly to what I just said about McBride and the recycling reconsidered argument, they end up rendering invisible the most important parts of the problem. So here's what they say: the low carbon footprints prized by cities such as San Francisco and Seattle are little more than accounting tricks. The main method of carbon accounting attributes to urban areas only the emissions resulting from in-city activities and regional power plants. Few studies count the full cycle of emissions for all goods and services consumed by all individuals and groups in cities, or emissions resulting from air travel. So, what they're arguing is that if you actually look at the latter, instead of just in-city activities, but you look at outside city activities that contribute to the social and economic existence of the city, you end up seeing that there are massive emissions outside the city that are directly connected to city building and city life. And this is, so that one of the arguments that Daniel Aldana Cohen makes in the Jacobin article, Seize the Hamptons, wonderful title, which you'll recall, people like Owen, the Owen article that you read, claim that Manhattan is the most ecological place on the planet because everybody's densely packed into Manhattan. And Cohen is kind of saying, well, that's actually kind of nonsensical because it depends which neighborhood. And if you look at the, monthly and yearly consumption activities of, let's say, people who live on the Upper East Side, like a pretty wealthy neighborhood of Manhattan, it's a disaster. They fly, they go skiing, they buy stuff that's coming, they buy apples from like halfway around the world. So he's saying if you look at the actual carbon footprint of luxury consumption, even if the household itself is densely packed and has the various attributes that many of the pro-density authors like Owen invoke, it's actually not simply about spatial organization. It's about class and consumption as much as it is the organization of the city. So that's very much on the table here as well. So the point is that if we're talking about low carbon design within cities or elsewhere, we've got to have a broader conversation about a lot of things that also are not cited in the city itself. Materials, food, take food, just take that example. You could live in a high density area where your energy use is very efficient. But if you're consuming food that travels, let's say, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere and it travels from South America, your South American fruit, or your New Zealand fruit, and that fruit is itself produced through the use of fossil fuels to till the soil and to transport the food, your low imprint city starts to look pretty high carbon after all. So they're posing those questions.